Hello, everyone. My name is Devo Probol. I'm a joint PhD student inside the Annenberg School for Communication and within the Department of Sociology here at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm also a CDCS fellow. You'll be seeing more of me today, besides moderating this second panel, titled Everyday Resistance in and Through Digital Technologies. I'm joined by four panelists. The first who will be presenting is Betty Ferrari from the University of Glasgow. Betty is a lecturer in digital media at the University of Glasgow in the UK. Her research takes a comparative, critical, qualitative approach to examine social and political implications of digital technologies with a specific focus on social justice activism. She's currently working on a comparative project about mutual aid activism across the US, the UK, and Italy, which is funded by the British Academy. Prior to joining Glasgow, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan and at the Center of Digital Culture and Society at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also an alum at Annenberg, so welcome back, Betty. Our second panelist is Jingyi Gu, and Jingyi is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Digital Culture and Society here at Annenberg. She's a feminist using feminist and transnational lenses. She studies the issues of identity, relationship, governance, and resistance within digital cultures in Chinese and global contexts. Her current book project centers on the cultural and economic production in live streaming and explores its reconfiguration of intimacy, labor, and subjectivities in contemporary China. Jingyi holds a PhD in Media and Communications from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Our third panelist is Jinsook Kim. Jinsook is an assistant professor in the Department of Film and Media at Emory University. Her research interests include digital media, online hate culture, and social and political activism in the context of contemporary South Korea. Her work on digital media culture has appeared in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Feminist Media Studies, Communication, Culture and Critique, and Signs, Journal of Women and Culture in Society. She is currently writing a book titled Sticky Activism, Online Misogyny and Feminist Activism in South Korea. Our final panelist is Joe Zhu. Joe is an assistant professor of media studies at Old Dominion University. His research looks at globalization of the Chinese tech industry, particularly at the intersection of state policy, labor practices, and digital platforms. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan's Digital Studies Institute and obtained his PhD in Media and Cultural Studies from the Department of Communication Arts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So without further ado, we'll get started.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Devo for the introduction, and thanks to Gobin and Trang for organizing this conference, which has been great so far. So today I'm going to talk about a slice of an ongoing project that I'm working on and that some of you have already heard a little bit about, and which focuses on mutual aid activism during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. In today's presentation, I'm going to talk specifically about the big role that Instagram has played for mutual aid activism. And this was very surprising to me when I first started working on this project in 2020. And I think my surprise speaks to the fact that this platform has been relatively under-researched when it comes to activism, and specifically more radical forms of activism, despite actually being really quite popular with activists. Mutual aid, which is at the core of this talk, can be defined as collective coordination to meet each other's needs and build a shared understanding about why people do not have what they need. Mutual aid projects simultaneously offer material support to people, whether in the form of food or medicines or grocery deliveries, while also working to educate people on the root causes of inequality and getting them involved in political activity. In my work, I rely on definitions of mutual aid by Dean Spade, whose book that came out in 2020 has been hugely influential for this wave of mutual aid activists. However, mutual aid really has a long history in the United States, particularly among communities of color, and the most well-known example is the work of the Black Panther Party and their free breakfast program. Mutual aid projects began emerging fairly quickly all over the world at the beginning of the pandemic, and in the US in particular, there was a huge growth of mutual aid in conjunction with the protests for racial justice of summer 2020. In my research, I argued that there are three remarkable aspects that characterize pandemic mutual aid. First, it has been unprecedented in scale, involving so many people who had never been before involved in grassroots activism, and this has resulted in a highly heterogeneous movement with different ideas about the political meaning of mutual aid itself. Secondly, pandemic mutual aid has been truly global, and I'm not saying this lightly, but I think this should make us think very seriously about similarities and differences between different experiences across national borders. And lastly, this wave of activism, of mutual aid activism, has been digitally mediated. Instagram accounts, Facebook groups, Google spreadsheets, WhatsApp chats. Activists relied on many different digital technologies to coordinate their work. And these technologies facilitated the spread of mutual aid, supported activists in collecting donations and recruiting volunteers, but also constrained and frustrated activists. And I'm addressing these three remarkable aspects of post-pandemic mutual aid in this project that I'm working on, which is shaping up to be a book, and in which I'm looking at mutual aid and the digital mediation of mutual aid in three countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Italy. And there are sort of two macro directions that I'm pursuing with this. On the one hand, I'm very interested in how activists define mutual aid, how they conceptualize mutual aid and its political meaning, and I'm particularly interested in whether we can see differences in these three countries. And I'm tentatively working with this distinction of thinking about conceptualizing a radical model in the United States, a civic model in Britain, and a militant model in Italy. And on the other hand, and obviously this won't be shocking to those of you who already know me, I'm interested in the relationship between mutual aid activists and digital technologies. What can this wave of activism tell us about the potential for digital technologies to facilitate solidarity under conditions of emergencies? And what would technologies for solidarity actually look like? One piece of this larger project has to do with Instagram and how it has been used within the mutual aid movement. As I was saying before, the use of Instagram remains relatively understudied, particularly when it comes to more radical social justice actors using Instagram. Some scholarship has begun to emerge, particularly around this idea of activist slideshows or social justice slideshows that was also much talked about by popular media. And this is, this idea that Instagram is being used by activist-minded individuals to create these visually appealing sort of activist PowerPoints that are explaining different things. I'm interested in two aspects of this relationship with Instagram, and they sort of hang together. On the one hand, what do activists do with Instagram? What are the functions that Instagram performs for activists, and how do activists navigate this platform? And this is a talk that you're hearing today. But on the other hand, sort of connected to this, what can we say about mutual aid in relation to the specific aesthetics of Instagram? And so I'm working on these two issues in two separate but sort of connected book chapters. I'm just going to talk about like the first piece today, but I'm happy to take questions on sort of the aesthetics parts as well. Briefly, how I've been doing this work. This project builds on different types of data, and specifically digital ethnographic data and in-depth interviews. Overall, in my research, as I was saying, I'm looking at three countries, but for my work on Instagram, I'm only focusing on the US and Italy because Instagram has played a much less important role in the UK, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. At the very beginning of this project, I conducted a digital ethnography of mutual aid groups in Philadelphia, which ended up focusing specifically on Instagram. And in addition to this more systematic digital ethnography, I've also been observing for quite some time now, there's many mutual aid Instagram accounts from the US and Italy, and I've conducted so far 40 in-depth interviews with mutual aid activists in Italy and the US. So first of all, Instagram has been the key social media platform for mutual aid activists in the US and Italy. And here you can see Joshua discussing this aspect. Quote, and ultimately, Instagram over Facebook. Instagram is where people are. Instagram is where people that are working in this field are. Instagram is where people that care about this are. I think part of that might be due to a younger demographic. I know that for a lot of the organizations, the amount of interaction and followers that they have on Instagram is exponentially more. I think that for my situation, I think I probably have literally 10 times as many Instagram followers as Facebook, and I have it just because it links and it's easy. But if I needed to do two different things for that, I don't know if I would. Instagram is where people are, unquote. And Joshua is really conveying this idea of Instagram just being central to mutual aid, right? Something that comes, and this is something that comes up again and again in my interviews. Instagram just became their all-encompassing, like their everything social media platform. And in my analysis, I identify 9 distinct functions that Instagram plays for mutual aid groups. I'm not going to go in depth into all of them, just these 3 that I'm highlighting: explaining, documenting and archiving, and educating. And before I show you what I mean by those, I'm just going to sort of briefly run through the other 6. So Instagram helps activists recruit volunteers. It helps activists ask for help and for donations in kind that have typically been food or clothing. It helps activists fundraise, even though this doesn't typically happen through Instagram itself, but this is about linking to other fundraising platforms. It helps activists amplify community requests for individual aid. So, for instance, by sharing individual stories of hardship or need and directing followers to donate directly, typically through payment apps. It also helps activists refer their followers to external resources. So, for instance, during the pandemic, it was about informing followers of upcoming COVID-19 testing opportunities or later on the vaccines. And then it also helps activists to connect with other organizations, whether they are other mutual aid groups or other political and non-political organizations. While many of these activist functions can also be performed by other platforms, such as Facebook and Twitter, and we've seen a lot of this sort of in the literature, what is notable in the case of Instagram is how this plays out in a platform that we consider to be centered on visuals, more specifically. So now on to the 3 functions that I want to talk about a bit more. A great amount of the content produced by mutual aid groups on Instagram is devoted, perhaps unsurprisingly, to just explaining what mutual aid is, how mutual aid works, and how people can contribute. And this was really the predominant type of content posted by these accounts, and it comes in the format of slideshows, stories, reels. It was very common for these accounts to post FAQs, as you can see here on the left, or often saved to the highlights of the account so people could always find them. And on the right, you see a post from one of the Italian mutual aid groups, which explains their initiative of providing free COVID testing and how to sign up. And in this article that I published in 2022 that you see cited at the bottom, I argue that this type of content that was often very simple and repetitive actually contributed to a routinization of mutual aid, to constructing mutual aid as something routine, mundane, that many, many people can contribute to daily. Another function is what I call documenting and archiving, and this included different types of content. Some of it had to do with quite literally documenting the work of the mutual aid that was being done by posting pictures of it or resharing media coverage. Other times it was directed at accounting for how the groups operated, including by offering transparency into budgeting processes. But I think the most striking content directed at documenting and archiving was about the experiences of COVID-19 themselves, such as by creating quarantine diaries. This is an example from an Italian collective that asked people to submit short entries that documented their experiences during the lockdowns, and then these stories were illustrated by artists who volunteered to support the collective. And the last function that I want to touch upon is that of political education, because crucial to the concept of mutual aid is the idea that any material support that is provided should be complemented by creating a political understanding of why material support is needed. So there's this idea of educating people about where injustice might come from and offering pathways to getting involved in fighting for justice. And Instagram represented an accessible avenue for these mutual aid activists to do this type of political education. And here you have a post that is titled, "What is mutual aid?" But the explanation is not about the specifics of how the mutual aid group works, but like in the explaining function, but rather what is the political meaning of mutual aid. And here, sort of how this form of activism is steeped in Black and disabled communities, right? This is about sort of thinking about the politics of mutual aid. And now I want to talk about how activists experience the centrality of Instagram. And what I find is that there was quite a bit of discomfort and of worry, really, in these activists, particularly around this idea that they might not be doing Instagram right, that they somehow weren't living up to what they were supposed to do with Instagram. And for instance, Ashley says, quote, "I mean, we understand that you have to have social media, I think, to exist, to be considered an entity in this world for people to find you. But I think that we're really bad at it. In our group, we have a couple of people who are tasked with doing social media. And I remember at our last meeting, we had an in-person meeting at a park a couple of weeks ago. Afterwards, the social media person said, 'Oh God, next time we need to take pictures.' So we just totally forgot that you need to have content to put on your social media. So that's been, I think, a challenge because I think it's not inherent to the work we're doing. I think it makes more sense when you're doing in-person work because you have images, you have things that are interesting to look at. And when you have remote work, it's boring, it's Zoom meetings. What are you going to put on social media? End quote. And here, Ashley is talking about social media in general, but in the context of the interview, this was really about Instagram because that's the social media that this particular group used. And you can sense sort of this apprehension around having to have images that are interesting to look at and worrying that they might be bad at doing Instagram. Some of these concerns, some of these worries really come through in this idea that the activists themselves don't feel Instagram savvy enough or that their groups would need to involve more people that are good at Instagram. Some of these concerns are also tied up with trying to guess what the algorithm wants and what would work well with the platform. And you can see this in Patricia's quote, on Instagram, I mostly do the stories. It's hard to know what should be a post or whatever. And then I feel like if you do a post and it doesn't get a lot of likes, and then you're like, oh, I don't know, what did I do wrong? Was it the wrong time? End quote. And Patricia is not alone in saying this in these attempts at sort of guessing what she should do and what she might be doing wrong. And this emerges very strongly from my interviews with activists, and I find it quite remarkable, just this framing of doing things wrong. So what do I think is going on here? In the paper, I argue that these worries around doing Instagram right reflect a few aspects of Instagram and digital media in general that scholars have been discussing for a while. We know that all users of social media, but activists in particular, experience pressures that are connected to the speed of digital media and the immediacy that is built into platform cultures. I'm going to look at Anna Kaun here, who's done work on this. There are pressures connected to sort of the black boxing of algorithmic governance, right? And you can see this in these mutual aid activists trying to guess what they should be doing for the algorithm. And this sort of, for instance, relates to Tena Bucher's work on algorithmic imaginaries. There's also something specific about the aspirational and inspirational aesthetics of Instagram that Tama Lever and colleagues discuss at length in their wonderful book on Instagram. Activists sort of feeling like they should be better at matching the specific aspirational aesthetics of Instagram, and I write a bit more about this in the other part of my work on Instagram that I mentioned. But I also want to suggest that these worries also speak to the long-standing permanence of certain myths about digital activism and the centrality of digital technology for activism, which scholars have been critiquing, but that are sort of still out there, right? All of these tropes, we've heard about techno-solutionism before, but all of these tropes about technology as a silver bullet for activism, which result in these unreasonable expectations that activists experience also in this way of feeling that, not using technologies in the best possible way, whatever that might mean, can really harm them. And then quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, my analysis shows that Instagram is fulfilling many functions for mutual aid activists and that it has been a crucial platform for mutual aid. But it's also clear that these activists have a complicated relationship with Instagram. And in particular, these worries that come to be expressed in terms of doing Instagram right reflect some of the logics of the platform, but also speak to longstanding tropes and myths about the centrality of technology that many have critiqued, but that are often still embedded in how we think and talk about digital activism. And just to conclude, I owe thanks to the different institutions that have supported this research, the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan when I was a postdoc there, the British Academy and the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and the Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Germany. And thanks to all of you for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Hello, everyone. Again, really grateful that all of you are here today. So today I will be sharing a paper that I've been working on, which is not part of my book project, which is on a slightly different sort of topic. So the title of it is titled #Baby Solid Food, the Contested Everyday Feminist Resistance in Negotiating Algorithmic Visibility. More on baby solid food in terms of what it is. So On Chinese lifestyle social media platform, its name is Xiaohongshu, which I think a lot of people consider it to be the Chinese version of Instagram because of the type of content over there and also its sort of operational model. So this application on this particular platform, the application of this hashtag baby solid food, which is 宝宝辅食 in Chinese, which means that the solid food baby eats apart from the formulas and also all the sort of liquidy food that they eat. So the application of this hashtag and its users post took a surprising turn since March 2023, from initially being used for its literal meaning in diary style or tutorial themed posts about preparing solid food for babies as new parents, especially moms. This hashtag has since been appropriate for use in a variety of content unrelated to baby diets, posted predominantly by women who are child-free, mostly very young, very urban kind of crowd, ranging from selfies, lifestyle sharing such as shopping, try-on hauls, makeup tutorials, and restaurant or food recommendations, to sometimes discussion about gender and feminist issues. Essentially, this hashtag was appropriated from its original context and has been given a different symbolic meaning and a new function. The popularization of this hashtag was due to an alleged hack that had been circulated on Xiaohongshu. If you post with the hashtag baby solid food, then your post will not be seen by male users. This happened against the backdrop of this previously female-dominated social platform, drawing in more male users and thus creating heightened tensions between user groups of different genders. This platform is China's biggest lifestyle platform, which integrates social media and e-commerce. It is also mainly used for sharing consumption-based lifestyle content, but it also has created spaces for users to share other aspects of their lives beyond consumption, partially because of its female-dominated user base. Female users used to take up about 90% of this platform, and then now it's down to 70%. According to many female users of the platform, the increasing number of male users on this platform has brought unsolicited attention to the content that they created, which further led to replies and also private messages from these male users that resemble either sexist judgments and sexual harassment. And using this hashtag allegedly can prevent their posts from being seen by the male users, although the original of this hack is challenging to trace. So in this paper, I try to understand what drives these women to use hashtag baby solid food in posting everyday lifestyle content, and how this hashtag was first appropriated from its original context and then become popular in this type of use. I also examine how such practices are afforded and mediated within the platform's socio-technical system, and how can we understand this practice within the current gender politics in China. So I employ a qualitative approach that combines content analysis and discourse analysis. My data collection used hashtag baby solid food as the search keyword, and then I selected 120 posts, which are posted between March 2023 to August 2023. The total amount of the posts with this hashtag is massive, so I have to adopt some kind of mechanisms in selecting them. So I chose about 20 posts from each month, and each of these posts I've chosen forced under one of these conditions. It either questioned or discussed the purpose of using hashtag baby solid food, or it prompted comments inquiring about or discussing the usage of this hashtag, or it have generated comments from both male and female users which showcased tensions around these gender topics. So in my analysis, I paid attention to users' engagement and also perceptions of particular technological components of the platform, including this hashtag and also its recommendation system. I also looked for the social and cultural references that are embedded in these posts and the comments they generated. So I will share some of the results that I've been able to identify with my analysis. Even though these posts cover a variety of topics and forms, there are some shared characteristics and patterns. The first screenshot over here exemplifies the most common type of post that used hashtag baby solid food. They're clothing try-on posts or selfies. But what's special about these clothes that is being featured in this picture is that they're either figure hugging or to some extent skin revealing. So within the current sort of discourse and discussion of gender issues in China, there is a saying on the freedom of wearing anything, according to women's own will without being judged. So many users share the pictures of their try-ons of this type of clothing, or just like selfies whenever they wear this type of clothing, are embracing this freedom, but they want to be away from male gazes that sexualizes their bodies and judge their character based on rather conservative views on gender. So using this hashtag in their posts serves this purpose. Oftentimes, these posts are followed by sharing where to buy these clothes that were featured in these pictures. The second post here showcases a type of empowerment of women type of content that derived from the first one. Often still contains photos of women dressed up in this style of clothing, but accompanied by texts that have more or less a feminist inspired undertone and framing. So you can see over here the translation of the title of this post is "Don't Tell Me What a Woman Should Be Like." The third type of post that I have a screenshot over here that also utilizes this hashtag is no longer about clothing or style anymore, but is more explicitly about feminist or gender issues, as exemplified by the one here. It is a post about sharing information about sexual assault case that happened in a well-known Chinese electric car company. So the user who made the post wanted this to widely circulated only among women in the hope of bringing some public attention to the case that may lead to the justice of the victim. The second and third type of posts not just use hashtag baby solid food, but also other hashtags such as only visible to women, hashtag girl talk, hashtag girl power, hashtag feminism. In general, the practices of using hashtag baby solid food here showcases user excising their agencies in employing a specific hashtag tactic as a tool for self-categorizing and self-classifying content in the hope of managing and limiting algorithmic visibility of their content, based on the perception that recommendation systems use hashtag as a data point to sort content and determine their relevancy and visibility to particular user groups. And hashtag baby solid food, according to the belief of these users, is a hashtag that rendered their content as only relevant to women, but not to men. And how does this hashtag become popular among so many users and gradually trending on the entire platform? Because the hashtag was used not by its literal meaning, but rather juxtaposed with the type of content that are mentioned before, so it attracted a lot of curiosities from both women and men, of course. There are posts specifically asking what is hashtag baby solid food. There's a lot of them, but more discussion about it often appear under posts that have already used this hashtag. Users would voluntarily introducing the reasons for employing this hashtag to each other. Some would just say something, it blocks the male users, or the one that I have in the screenshot here actually says it blocks the male babies. The male babies, nanbao, is a derogatory term also sort of developed within the Chinese feminist discourse from seeing their posts. And some would also give their understanding of the technical process behind. But more importantly, many users would also promote and actively discuss the cause of using this hashtag, basically why male users need to be blocked. Furthermore, they would also recommend other hashtags that they believe have similar functions. For example, the ones mentioned in also the discussion over here, like hashtag pregnancy diary and hashtag what if baby cry at night. Many scholars in critical digital studies and HCI argued that user-generated gossips and folk theories about processes of collective and communal production of knowledge about given technological systems, drawing from their everyday use experiences of these platforms, when they have neither the technical expertise nor access to the sometimes opaque informations about how these algorithms works. But these gossips and folk theories are not only productive, but can also be subversive to the power that platform upholds upon their users. So this case of user discussing and promoting hashtag baby solid food and its cause can be seen as a process of users developing collective developing and disseminating gossips and folk theories of algorithmic features of the platform. It transformed using such a hashtag from individual processes to collective actions that is based on shared knowledges and a common goal to prevent women-centered content from being surfaced to male users' content feed. So studies on digital activism and resistance have taken us to understand specific types of individual or collective actions, such as algorithmic resistance and also hashtag activisms. Algorithmic resistance is conceptualized to be tactics of resistance that are complicit with algorithmic logic but resist its output, or tricking these algorithms to work toward unintended results. While hashtag activism theorists as marginalized groups strategically employing hashtag as a shortcut to make political contentions which enables their narrative agency and forms network counterpublics. But my analysis of the employment, engagement, and discussion of a specific hashtag, hashtag baby solid food in this case, is not really a case of hashtag activism, I would argue, but it does reveal that such strategic practices do comply with the logic of the algorithmic processes, but by appropriating this hashtag out of its original context, they hope for alternating their outcome. So I consider these practices crowdsourced everyday feminist resistance, taking the form of negotiating algorithmic visibility with hashtags and resisting both the sort of sexist and misogynistic cultural forces embodied in male users' gay sexualization harassment, as well as the platform and algorithmic power in structuring content distribution and organizing social lives. This hashtag practice is prevalent in ordinary users' engagement with Xiaohongshu, and what makes it different from cases of hashtag activism is that it's not prompted by specific incidents, but more as a reflection of this shared everyday experience. Its application is also in uneventful and mundane content production, and also not associated with any specific narratives or forms. I also want to underscore the fact that it is crowdsourced, that this hack really comes out of nowhere, because it was but then it was escalated from individual practices to collective action by ordinary users voluntarily spreading the information to each other and call for action. And there were no particular figures of leadership or significant networks of relationships in impacting its dissemination. It was carried out based on the collective gender awareness across a more dispersed crowd. However, this is not the end of the story, of course. There are contesting narratives and opposing voices about this hashtag-oriented practices. For example, many actual moms complained about how this is taking away their space and voices. And in working with the complex mechanisms of this algorithmic recommendation system, the increasing usage of this hashtag itself also become a signal for the system to recognize its popularity, which in turn circumvent their users' initial intention. Later upon Xiaohongshu, male users started posing with this hashtag. Also, many used this hashtag to specifically search for this type of pictures of women and directing, again, back their male gaze and sexualization. Some users also questioned the functionality of this hashtag in observing what they call a reappropriation of this hashtag by content that is intended for phishing male users with sexually explicit photos or posts and content that simply just use of this hashtag just to attaining internet traffic in general, but almost everyone on this platform. So I think it's really important to contextualize the emergence of this form of digital resistance within the gender politics in China, especially with its formation, organization, and contestation increasingly taking place in digital and online spaces. The mobilization and popularization of this particular hashtag epitomizes the current landscape of Chinese feminisms, a plural form, especially its fractures and pitfalls. This type of lifestyle content posted with this hashtag resembles sort of characteristics of popular feminism. It's the narratives about empowerment through consumption. It's through making yourself feel confident in your own skin. And there's also this sort of school of radical feminism developed in China, which advocates for gender separatism and women-only spaces, not majority online, but also offline. Both popular feminism and more radical gender separatism increased the visibility of feminism in public in China, accompanied by the increased and intensified network misogyny, exemplified by the cases of these increasing just unsolicited the attention and private messages. So I want to further argue that this form of crowdsourced everyday feminist resistance showcased nuanced and even contested narratives within its digital manifestation, particularly because it is dependent on and operates within the technical infrastructure of a commercial platform, which appropriates and then capitalizes on user activities, sometimes intended for certain social causes for its own interests, in which attention and visibility becomes hyper-commodified. While this form of hashtag-centered algorithmic resistance was intended for managing and limiting visibility of certain content, with the technical intervention of the platform and the social mediation, it was turned the other way around, eventually due to the hyper-visibility of itself. As you can see, this hashtag itself has, I think, at the time I concluded data collection, it had 23 billion, but that was a more recent screenshot. That's actually an older screenshot, I'm sorry. So I will conclude over here and looking forward to your questions.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My presentation today is titled Feminist Storytelling of K-Culture, Alternative Voices and Everyday Activism in South Korea. So in recent years, there has been a trend in K-neologism, like combining the Roman letter K for South Korea with the commercial products and media content associated with Hallyu or the Korean wave, including K-drama, K-pop, K-fashion, K-food, and K-cosmetics. And as you can see here, but there is I think it like this. So the K-quarantine, which refers to the government's successful handling of the coronavirus pandemic, as Youngmin introduced in the first panel. And you can also see here the K-cop or K-police wave, which refers to the endorsements of countries' country's police forces, including the exportation of police weapons such as water cannons that have been used in other Asian countries like Thailand to disperse demonstrations and suppress democratic movements in such countries. Okay. And I found this interesting infographic. It was created by Korean writer by John Dunbar. He wrote an article in the Korea Times. It's titled "The Korea's K-Iceberg Continues to Grow." So you have heard of this, right? I'm here. The K-pop, K-drama, K-food, but they are just tip of iceberg. And then you can see the tons of other uses of K-related namings, although it's a little bit difficult to see. And these quotes show how Korean government has been promoting, utilizing, and expanding K-naming as a way to boost Korea's national image and competitiveness in the global market. So for instance, former First Lady Kim Jong-suk said, "We feel proud of our Koreanness when we see the words with the added K." Or the Seoul Tourism Organization said, "Going beyond covering K-pop songs and dance moves, people from all over the world are now aiming to follow the trends with the start with K, including K-lifestyle." However, the popularization of K-naming and the nationalist sentiment on which it is built has not been a strictly top-down process. Rather, as a technique of governance, these nation branding efforts have involved the mobilization and participation of the Korean public in their co-creation. And nation branding is also a process of national identity building. So ordinary citizens, Korean citizens, have not only participated actively in branding campaigns, but also negotiated and contested the process of K-nation branding at times, criticizing the dominant celebratory K discourse. So you can see on the left side, here's a Korean drag queen, Hee Ji-young, also known as Hurricane Kimchi. His holding this picket saying, sure, K-pop, K-dramas are cool, but what about K-homophobia and K-racism? And on the right side, you can see the activists who are holding a protest during the 2020 Korea Police World Expo, which promoted the exportation of the K-water cannon to other Asian countries. So this study explores to challenge and appropriate the K-nation branding discourse and produce alternative stories about K-culture through digital media, particularly from feminist perspective. Specifically, I examined two recent uses of the K prefix in digital media culture, K-장녀, K-eldest daughter, and kiddo out, K-pedophile out. I will be explaining shortly. And in terms of theoretical framework, I was informed by critical approaches to nation branding. National identity focuses on the tensions and contradictions within nation branding projects. I'm particularly interested in examining diverse ideological positions and the multiplicities of voices in the process of negotiating national identity. Building on these studies, I explore again women's responses and resistance to the dominant discourse and the production of alternative stories through everyday use of digital media. So let me first explain the K-장녀 or K-eldest daughter. So who's K-eldest daughter? It became a buzzword since 2020, and it's a compound word of the letter K in Korea and 장녀, which means the eldest daughter in the family. And the coinage has been widely used by young women in a self-mocking way that they have experienced and endured the patriarchal culture in a family having this kind of characteristics. For instance, overdeveloped sense of responsibility, profound modesty, or tendency to grand conditions. So I want to show you an example of this reaction videos of young women. They're talking about some of the words as they were growing up.
수윤아, 네가 잘해야 네 동생도 잘하는 거야.
누나가 모범을 보여야지. 그래야 동생이 보고 배우지.
너무 진짜 저희 엄마 같아요. 너무 엄마 같아요. 이 못마땅해하는 표정.
아 진짜?
수윤아, 네가 잘해야 네 동생도 잘하는 거야.
누나가 모범을 보여야지. 그래야 동생이 보고 배우지.
너무 진짜 저희 엄마 같아요. 너무 엄마 같아요. 이 못마땅해하는 표정.
아 진짜?
우리 은비는 혼자서도 잘하지?
아니 난 이 말이 제일 싫었어. 진짜 우리 엄마인 줄 알았네. 항상 혼자서도 먼저 하라고 했지 우리 엄마 아빠. 알아서도 잘하는 딸이 어디 있습니까 세상에.
아니 먼저 태어났다고 해서 알아서 잘할 수 있는 능력을 갖고
맞아,
나오는 게
맞아.
아닌데 왜 그거를 장녀라는 이유로
어린 은비의 삶의 낙은 부모님을 실망시키지 않는 것. 그래서 그때는 부모님이 동생보다 나한테
엄마 일 있어서 나가니까 이따 동생 밥 좀 차려줘.
우리 엄마 아빠가 맞벌이를 하는데 이제 일 나가니까 동생 밥을 챙겨주래. 근데 이거 처음에는 재밌어가지고 막 챙겨주는데 이게 어느 순간 법칙이 된 거야. 당연히 너가 밥을 해줘야 되고 이걸 안 하는 순간 엄마한테 혼나는 거야. 동생도 할 수 있잖아. 나 12살 때부터 했는데 쟤 13살인데 왜 내가 이거 해야 돼? 약간 이렇게 반박을 했더니 쟤는 남자잖아. 내 동생 늘 물어. 가 들어가 있어 무조건. 왜냐면 동생한테 전화해서
Just watch this video, the part of the video. The usual description of K eldest daughter is a woman who have sacrificed themselves or have been repressed emotionally because it is considered their responsibility to take care of their siblings or aging parents. However, while they are in this sense the pillars of the family, right? But they are excluded from many of the benefits and rights afforded to sons, irrespective of the birth order. Just personal note, I'm also K-장녀, so I can relate to these reactions too. So, and I also include here popular comments left under the videos. So for instance, the first one talking about, I'm at home with my brother, an adult, and me, a minor, but my mom asked me if I took care of my brother's meal, right? And she said, there's no logic to Confucianism, it's just ridiculous demand. And the second one is talking about, it's funny that people think that gender discrimination was over in mother's generation, but they've been looking around most of the girls who have a bad relationship with their older brother or younger brother because they were discriminated against at home due to their gender. So despite the prevailing post-feminist belief that gender inequality belongs to the past, these young women view the family as a first space in which they encounter and endure patriarchal authority and violence in culture. And this K-장녀 discourse questions and complicates the rigid patriarchal norms embedded in the K-nation branding efforts by appropriating the K prefix. So nation branding includes not only the exportation of the Korean commercial products, but also promotion of the desirable cultural values and norms as a significant source of national prestige and power. In particular, traditional Confucian values emphasizing family bonds and relationships have been understood as uniquely Korean, but would appeal to other foreign audiences from similar country. For instance, the success of K-dramas in other Asian countries since the late 1990s has been often explained in this term because South Korean dramas all really value the family relationship and bonds because of that they were really successful in other similar countries in Asia or Latin America. So the K eldest daughter discourse then challenges this dominant narrative of Korea's cultural and moral values built on Confucianism and of the family as a fundamental unit of the society and the core of K culture. Their counter-narrative suggests that such nation branding cannot but fail domestically because it is built on the exploitation and concealment of the women's labor that undergirds the Korean family system and the Korean society as a whole. And this, the picture on the below is the inaugural K Family Festival that kicked off this year, which aims to convey the value of Korean traditional family culture as a solution to aging country's record low fertility rate and family dissolution. So while the K-장녀 narrative shows how domestic audiences, especially women, reinterpret their national identity and produce personalized stories about K culture and K family through digital media, digital feminist campaign by Keto Out condemns and shames the country and its juridical system on the international stage through their participatory and creative form of digital activism. Oh. Pop. So keto is a compound word of Korea, and pedophile, as you can see, was created to highlight the negligence of South Korea towards child sex crimes. Next slide. Okay. They consist of anonymous women online, and they launched a crowdfunding campaign to display this advertisement in New York City's Times Square. So through crowdfunding effort, they raised a total of $76,000 within 2 weeks. So on September 1st, 2020, they paid for this display of this advertisements to raise awareness of the light punishment that purveyors of child pornography receive in Korea. And the advertisement directly addressed the case of Son Jung-woo, who was the administrator of the largest darknet child pornography site, Welcome to Video. And this site involved more than 200,000 videos showing sex acts involving children, infants, toddlers, and earning Son $4 million. After an international effort drawing on an agency from UK, USA, and Korea, they finally shut down the site. And in March 2018, Son was arrested in Korea and having been found guilty of producing and distributing child pornography. But he was sentenced to only 18 months in jail. So in 2019, when U.S. Department of Justice requested his extradition to face money laundering and other charges in an American court, Korean court rejected the request, which was made on the grounds that keeping him in South Korea would help the country in its effort to track down the users of his sites for possible indictment. So it was after Son's release from custody in 2020, these angry women users banded together to establish Kedo Out with the goal of drawing attention to the lax treatment that perpetrators of digital sexual crimes receive in Korean courtrooms. So I interpret Kedo's activism as an example of the challenges to the celebratory imagining of Korea as a global leader in information communication technology. And they really attempt to bring about domestic change by shaming the country on the international stage. So shaming the country is one of the common tactics of transnational human rights advocates. And because ICT has been so central to modern Korean identity and development since the 1990s, successive Korean governments have looked to ICT as a means to boost national identity and national competitiveness and to recover from financial crisis. So while the government has promoted the development of the most advanced ICT as resources for national power in the global market, Kedo's activism contradicts the narrative of success and further raise the question about the development and deployment of advanced technologies and their harms on women and children in Korea, shedding light on non-neglected aspect of digital sexual violence and voices from victims. So I situate the activism of Kedo Out within the broader context of collective feminist efforts in Korea to raise the issue of digital sexual violence and compel the government to address it. So taken together, these two cases call into question and complicate the patriarchal norms and practices embedded in the construction of so-called K culture, and the strategic use of K prefix to reveal their gendered experiences exemplify everyday activism, which involves the sharing of personal stories in public spaces with the aim of challenging the status quo. So I argue that they not only reveal the discordance between state-led national branding discourse and women's experiences within the nation, but also make cultural interventions in rebranding the nation by appropriating the K discourse and producing counter narratives. Again, the Korean government's promotion and representation of the nation in its nation branding efforts have internal as well as external audiences, while K-장녀 narrative demonstrates internal resistance to the governmental branding efforts of K. Kedo Out's activism mainly targets and communicates with international audiences. It shows how nation branding is directed both internally and externally. Understanding both these layers is important for the functioning of nation branding projects. I think this is the last line. Thank you so much for listening.
I do recognize that lunch is next, as Joe noted. So we'll start by taking audience questions. Yeah.
Thanks so much for all of these talks. This one is for you, Joe, if you don't mind. I was curious what it was like for you ethnographically to be positioned where you were and do this work, particularly interpersonally, right? First, how did you explain your work to others? But then also, like, what were the stakes for you? You talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the talk, but I'm curious how your even performance of this quiet quitting looked either similar to or different than the other workers you were surrounded by.
Thanks so much for the question. Yeah, I mean, I have a much longer spiel on the self-reflexivity of methodologies. Because for me, like, to understand work, I have to be a worker. Like, I basically just, have to understand how the everyday process goes. And yeah, there's definitely a problematic dimension in terms of my personality. I'm a global North academic. I have no stakes in any of the precarity that they're experiencing. But I realized by working with them, I think I can actually gain that particular underground experience and also relate that back to academia. Academia itself is fraught with precarity in many ways, just as bad as corporate world. So there's so much issues, especially in recent years, with, with more financially constrained institutions who are mass layoffs, huge austerity measures across campus. So I think there's actually a lot of resonance and actually made me make more connections between corporate and academic world, especially in the increasingly corporatized academic world as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for the panelists. I have a question for both Betty and Joe. For Betty, I know it's not a zero-sum game, but can you provide more insights about the trade-off between the need for on-site or more local organizing and the need for more online visibility? I'm thinking about the example of Funo bombs, and many chapters are not super visible on Instagram simply because their target audience, many are homeless, is just not actively using any digital media. So they're just not perceiving it as a necessary task in their daily organizing. And for Joe, I know you are doing ethnography inside a mobile gaming company, so I would like to know more about the issue of gaming in labor control and to what extent touching fish is associated with the gamification of labor and labor control, or borrowers' notion of work games, in addition to the everyday resistance to a productive regime, to what extent there's also this notion of elements or affect of fun and play in their resistance. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I totally agree with you that it's not a zero-sum game, right? And this idea of how does sort of local underground organizing versus more looking for more visibility online, that's an issue of labor, right? It's an issue of where activists, sort of how much activists can do, and they can't do everything, right? So there's, for each group that I've been looking at, like this has looked a little bit different. I will say because the groups that I've been studying specifically, which is not the entirety of mutual aid, but it's the groups that I've been studying have been mobilizing in the pandemic. For them, sort of this equation became even more complicated at a time in which the local was taking different shapes, right? So there was much less kind of the visible organizing in the streets as we would have thought about it, but there were other sort of more forms of hyper-local, even online organizing. So it's a very complex picture. And I think in my work, like I talk a lot about sort of this aspect with activists in terms of also the burnout that they've really suffered, right, in doing mutual aid during and after the pandemic, and how much sort of this has affected kind of their ability to mobilize and just like their personal trajectory. So it's I don't have an overarching answer, but it is something that I think activists themselves have been really reflexive about, thinking about what are the limits of online organizing to reach populations that would need to be included within any mutual aid effort. And I thought a lot about this, and on the other hand, sort of doing it in a moment in which, suddenly everything felt like it was online, like fully online and only online. And I think each group sort of had their own strategy to navigate this.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, I did work for a game company. Technically, it's framed around mobile tech in general. But because I was under NDA, so part of the IRB had to under NDA for like 5 years. So I couldn't actually talk about games. My dissertation is not even about games. It's like I worked in games for a year. So I studied labor processes. And one interesting thing I found about the relation between a game company in particular is that it's much easier to touch fish in the game company because they're pretty much framed, again, like along lines of Silicon Valley kind of culture. They have game consoles, they have stations. A lot of our work is to play test. So a lot of our work is play itself. So it makes it really difficult to distinguish this fine line between work and play when all of your products you're making are play oriented, right? So yeah, there are definitely workers who are just playing other games, not even their own games throughout the process. So I think it's much harder. That's why tech companies are so much more draconian. They install keyloggers. They prevent any kind of access to company FTPs just to prevent this kind of, again, pilfering and siphoning of corporate resources. Yeah.
Thank you for all of these wonderful presentations. I have a question for Jinsook. I was really interested in how you were juxtaposing the ghetto out and the K-장녀 discourse with South Korea's this emphasis on its technological infrastructures, on the socio-technical imaginaries of digital Korea. So I was wondering, I was really interested in how they were using digital technology as a tool to shame the country. Can you elaborate a little bit more about if there's any direct continuity of resisting this idea of digital Korea or the technological imaginaries of Korea when they were circulating discourse about K-장녀 and ghetto out resistance movements?
Thank you for the question. I think, right. I primarily talk about how their activism was resisting against this technological imaginary of Korea as a digitally advanced country. But also I will say, all these women are really, really tech savvy, and because they know how to play the game. So for instance, when they produce this kind of videos, they opened a YouTube channel. They also uploaded all the videos in English, and also to increase the visibility of their content, they also used different digital media platforms like Twitter, and they made a hashtag, and then they are using using the hashtag. They know how to make the hashtag trending on Twitter, right? So they are really collectively organizing the movements, and I think that in that way they're really using the technologies to speak out against this digital sexual violence as well. So I think the notion of algorithmic visibility and how these activists are playing with this algorithmic visibility are also relevant to my work as well. And whenever I hear about how K-pop fandoms they know how to play the game, they know how they are ruining the Trump speech, for instance, in the United States. I think that's one of the important origin of this kind of algorithm resistance. It is definitely in Korea, and how women in Korea have been used this digital media platform to speak out against different forms of violence in the country. Thank you for the question.
Yes, thanks. Fascinating presentation. I have a question or maybe just a comment to Betty. I'm wondering if you have come across the concept of mediatization, mostly in the work of Andrea Hipp, Nicole Dre, and Steve Shawa, who is one of my colleagues. And I think the term is used to address the fact that the logic of media exerts a particularly, you could say, dominant influence on other social institutions like politics, sociality, and in this case, activism. So the media logic refers to a kind of institutional and technological, modus operandi of the media. So the particular ways that how media, for example, distribute material and symbolic resources operate with formal, informal rules, because what I can see this kind of obligatory feeling of taking photos, and also there's a certain right way to do activism, exemplify this kind of media logic, or you could say informal, formal rules that social behaviors and practices must adhere to in the case of Instagram in this case.
I've noted it down. No, I think you make a great point. And obviously I know about sort of the scholarship around mediatization. I haven't really used it here. I'm a little bit resistant to it, just in terms of I want to be cognizant of not making the entire story about mutual aid activism about media and about its mediatization. And I know this is contradictory from someone who just presented just on the Instagram slice, but it's interesting to me that sort of all of these things kind of hang together in a very contradictory way. So there's, on the one hand, there's this attention to sort of Instagram in this way, and this comes, I didn't say this before, but sort of in terms of from a bunch of people who are new to activism, and so who hadn't really necessarily kind of been involved in any type of large-scale activism before, or any activism at all. And so it's very interesting for me how they also sort of felt these pressures and where these pressures come from. And you're right, it might be exactly from like that type of mediatization. Yeah, I also want to be careful in sort of not kind of flattening everything about like this very complex sort of form of solidarity activism into like their media output. And I hope, and I try sort of in my work to kind of bring all of this together, even though today I only talked about like a small part of this. I hope that makes sense.
Other questions?
So it's gonna be a really quick question. I had a question for Jinsook. Thinking about how you laid out two audiences, like internal audiences and like external audiences. I'm curious about like how the women, producing videos and like producing about content about K-장녀 reality, are they also targeting like multiple audiences in terms of like international audiences, and that is really about nation shaming, and then are they also targeting like internal audiences about like other women in Korea and female women in Korean, and then like how they try to educate or like how they try to reveal the reality of K-장녀?
Okay. Thank you for the question. I think for the K-장녀 case, I think they're primarily I don't think they necessarily identify themselves as activists, and they were not really targeting anyone. But when they produced this kind of video, I think they wanted to talk about this K-장녀 and the shared experiences with domestic audiences primarily. But some of this the video I showed has English subtitle because they are like one of the big platforms on like YouTube. So they provide every video with English subtitles. So I found this one, but I think that most of the videos, for instance, they don't have English subtitles. So I see that they are just primarily targeted toward domestic audiences. And I think the primary aim of this producing this kind of videos is not just, I don't think it's more like to educate people, just to share more experiences and in a more humorous way. You know, I heard this kind of word, or you did too, and then like, you know, they are producing some, parody words in a humorous way, but not really to educate someone else. While the Keto Out case, they are more like activist oriented. They had a very clear goal to shame the country on an international stage. It's why they displayed this advertisement in New York Cities and Times Square. That's a symbolic like place. So I think they're a little bit different in terms of their goals and target audiences, I would say. Yeah.
Angry mom group that you mentioned, are there any reactions from the users that use the hashtag baby solid food that kind of addressing this angry group?
That's actually a very interesting question. Will lead into like a whole a discussion also on this type of discourse on this particular platform. But for the ones that I've collected, I haven't seen any like opposing the mom's complaints, but I do see more sort of echoing that complaint. Because I think there's, again, I want to sort of towards the end of my paper, I try to argue that this really epitomizes these fractures within feminisms, which is not everyone agree on the same thing. And also they are thinking that, oh, you are taking away our places of what's wrong to be a mom. And this is, again, speaks to another tension that was brought up by the more radical feminism in China that all moms are betrayal ideals of feminism. Like you should never get married and you should also not give birth to male babies, right? So this is all kind of tied narratives, which I think it's sort of is captured in this particular hashtag. But I don't see these moms are being sort of engaging actively with these people who are using this for other purposes, but rather I also remember a few posts that I collected, moms complaining about it, will also say that we are moms, we already have all these anxieties and duties, motherly duties in our life. When we were exposed to a picture of another woman with these, such perfect figure, it creates a lot of anxiety about our own bodies. So there's a lot of those narratives and discourses embedded in this particular type of complaints, which I didn't include here just for the sake of the time. But I think it's also speaking to these tensions about, again, what's a woman's role in their lives and all the different goals and pursuits that you can go after, and is there anything common that works as a common ground for people who have been inspired by feminism to come together? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a comment. I don't want to stand between you guys and lunch, but very quickly, really enjoyed all the presentations as well as the previous presentations. Just such diverse kind of range of discussions about really everyday forms of resistance. So I was thinking of, it reminds me of the film, Michelle Yeoh's film, right? What is it called? Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. But everything, everywhere, all the time. That's what we're talking about when we talk about everyday forms of resistance and activism. But there is another angle here which I think came up in your panel as well as in the earlier panel, which is when we talk about all the time, most of the analysis still focuses on contemporary cases, contemporary developments, but Betty did mention the Black Panther Party's earlier kind of history of mutual aid, and earlier on, I remember Chloe talked about the pre-mediation of the HIV/AIDS as a kind of pre-mediation of the present kind of crisis and activism. So I just wonder, I think there's also that time, the temporality element is still there, but I wonder whether we can sort of make it more salient in our discussions. I don't know how to frame my question. I guess one way to think about this is whether in the cases that you follow or over time, whether you see any kind of what kind of developments, what kind of changes in terms of people's tactics of everyday resistance. I would imagine that in Joe's case, people keep sharpening their tactics, changing their tactics, using new apps and so on. But how to think about kind of the temporality in everyday forms of activism? I guess that's my main question.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of history of like labor resistance, I mean, quieting is nothing new. It's a buzzword in the wake of the pandemic, but people have been quieting throughout. Slacking off is such a fundamental part. So yeah, like historically in Fordist regimes of labor is soldiering. They call it soldiering, where people will literally delay on the assembly lines just to. So there's definitely a huge historical dimension to my lit review, which I didn't really mention in my talk, but that's gonna flows into the current way that workers adapt, following the long-standing traditions of delaying work, disrupting, and taking resources and time away from corporate. So.
Okay, so two things. The first one is that I keep hoping that someone will soon publish like a global history of mutual aid so I can cite it, because it needs to be done. It's not going to be written by me, so someone else needs to write it. But no, this is just to say that with the idea of mutual aid, obviously it has been going on for such a long time. And I think one of the interesting things that sort of has led me to want to focus on this is also kind of uncovering like the ways in which like mutual aid has long been important for social movements, but we don't really talk about it. And this is both sort of social movement scholars don't necessarily talk about it as much, but also activists themselves do not necessarily like talk about it as much. And this was sort of change in the pandemic when mutual aid became really visible, and so that's one of the things that is interesting to me. The other aspect is also that like I'm also interested in sort of how we choose to remember specific acts of mutual aid. So obviously, like particularly U.S. groups, right? They celebrated the example of the Black Panthers really overwhelmingly over anything else, and it is of course an incredibly significant example. There's an excellent book by Alondra Nelson on sort of all that part of the activism of the Panthers. But there's also so much more, and we don't necessarily talk about it. And in doing sort of this kind of work comparatively, I'm also interested in seeing, okay, what are the historical examples that activists in the UK or in Italy sort of bring up when they are thinking about the history. And I've been having conversations with activists about this, and it's sort of a very kind of varied picture because the main sentiment seems to be like, yeah, of course, we've always done mutual aid, but then we can't really necessarily pinpoint like what are the examples that we look at. And so it's also interesting sort of how this practice kind of has survived for a very long time, but it's really sort of been hidden in many, many ways. And so I also see kind of like this work as a way of like uncovering some of that hidden history of mutual aid.
I just want to briefly answer. So, because I think I have been thinking about this question, the history, how I can situate my case studies, maybe and other studies within this broader historical context. I think that especially in relation to Kei Jangya, I think it's important to recognize that, there has been always Kei Ali's daughter, right, historically. But these are the mostly young women who are tech savvy, and they, have on spaces on YouTube, platforms like YouTube, and to talk about their shared experiences. But also, I think that there are, other stories like invisible stories, for instance, from like older generations and their experiences of like Kei Ali's daughter. I think, in that sense, I can also like historicize this particular generations and their experiences, when they talk about like this post-feminist like belief, which is widespread in South Korea, and how their experience are revealed that that's a big myth in South Korean society. And another thing is that in terms of tactic, I think, as I briefly mentioned earlier, I think a lot of these tactics, they build and they actually learn from the earlier activist tactics. For instance, even before the digital era, a lot of like online, like the K-pop fandom, for instance, in South Korea, mostly women, and they were using different platforms. Even before the digital era, they were really experts in social mobilization, issue raising. So I think that this is, I can definitely see the historical development of like social mobilization, issue raising, especially used by these women activists. So thank you for the question.
I think I've also been, like, in writing this paper, I've also been thinking about sort of the historical changes that happened in the way that, at least in the Chinese context, people engage with different forms of resistance and activism. And I think I'm so glad to hear about sort of Joe's case study of the sort of playfulness that still exists in tech company work environment. But I think I do notice there is some sort of changes in the more collective sort of tactic. I think in the time that was earlier on, that was more playfulness centered, there's a lot more humor, satire. I know, Guobing, you have written a lot about those as well. But then in this younger generations of digital media users, I see this more, at least like in the case of this hashtag particularly, there's this juxtaposition and things that doesn't make sense, and there's even going crazy. Like going crazy as a literary form is also very trendy on these platforms for young people to basically as an expression of complaints and expression of sort of hopelessness. So I do somewhat sense this almost a historical transition from there is the playfulness and there's the humor, and then transitioned into things that just doesn't make sense, as kind of exemplified in the case that I work on as well.
All right. Well, please join me with giving our panelists a round of applause for those presentations.